Phoenix, Arizona, 2004. A 16-year-old boy vanished from a quiet suburban street, his voice silenced, his dreams erased. The system, quick to accept a simple story, filed him away as a runaway. For 20 years, a father played the part of the devastated parent, a pillar of his community. But one aunt refused to let the ghost rest. Her relentless love, a single flickering candle in 2 decades of darkness, never knowing her fight would uncover a horrifying secret hidden in plain sight, just 1 floor above a city that had chosen to forget. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. The suffocating heat of August 2004 hung thick and oppressive in the modest Phoenix ranch house, the air shimmering with the kind of desert intensity that made breathing feel like drowning. At 16, Mason Parker possessed a talent that could fill any concert hall, fingers that danced across piano keys with the kind of raw, instinctive brilliance that spoke of limitless possibility. His music was hope made audible, a soaring, powerful melody that seemed to belong to a boy destined for greatness. But in the suffocating silence of the home he shared with his father, Robert, he was a caged bird, plotting his flight in frantic, stolen moments. Mason had learned to move through the house like a shadow. At 16, he'd grown tall and lean, with the kind of quiet intensity that marked him as different from his classmates at Desert Valley High School. While other kids his age were planning for prom or arguing about weekend parties, Mason was planning something far more dangerous: his escape. The acceptance letter to Juilliard had arrived 3 weeks earlier, hidden now beneath his mattress like contraband. A full scholarship, his ticket to New York City, to a life where his music could finally breathe. But telling his father, Robert, about the letter felt impossible, like asking permission to tear apart the very foundation of their 2-person world. Robert Parker was a man who measured love in chains. After Mason's mother died in a car accident when he was 8, Robert had wrapped his grief around his son like barbed wire, claiming protection while slowly suffocating the boy's spirit. Every friendship was monitored, every after-school activity scrutinized, every moment of independence treated as a betrayal. At 45, Robert worked as a security guard at a Phoenix office complex, a job that fed his need to watch, to control, to patrol the boundaries of what he considered safe. Music is a hobby, not a career, Robert would say whenever Mason mentioned his dreams. The real world doesn't care about your piano playing. You'll thank me later for keeping your feet on the ground. But Mason's music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, saw something in him that his father refused to acknowledge. She'd been the one to encourage his Juilliard audition, the one who'd recorded him playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, the piece that had earned him his scholarship. She was also the only adult who seemed to notice the way Mason flinched when his father's voice grew sharp, the way he made excuses for bruises that appeared after particularly heated arguments about his future. The house on Cactus Drive was a fortress of Robert's making. Security cameras watched every entrance, the kind of system that was supposed to keep danger out, but felt more like it was designed to keep something in. The windows were always locked, the curtains drawn. Neighbors rarely saw inside, and Robert preferred it that way. Susan Martinez had been fighting for her nephew's soul long before she knew he needed saving. At 38, she was everything her late sister Claire had been: warm, artistic, fiercely protective, and everything Robert despised. Where Robert saw danger in Mason's musical ambitions, Susan saw a gift that deserved nurturing. Where Robert demanded control, Susan offered freedom. The sisters had been close, 2 sides of the same creative coin. Claire had met Robert during her brief rebellious phase, drawn to his intensity before understanding it was really obsession. By the time Mason was born, The marriage was already fraying. Claire had confided to Susan that she was planning to leave Robert, that she was scared of what he might do if she tried to take Mason with her. Then came the accident. A rainy Tuesday evening, Claire's Honda skidding off Interstate 10. Robert had been working late that night. His alibi was airtight, confirmed by security footage at his job. But Susan never stopped wondering about the timing, about the convenient tragedy that solved Robert's biggest problem. After the funeral, Robert had systematically cut Susan out of Mason's life. Visits became supervised, then infrequent, then non-existent. Phone calls were monitored, letters intercepted. When Mason turned 13 and Susan tried to take him to lunch for his birthday, Robert called the police, claiming she was attempting to kidnap his son. But Susan never gave up. She would drive past Desert Valley High School just to catch glimpses of Mason walking to class. She sent birthday cards that she knew he'd never see. She kept a scrapbook of school concert announcements, proud of musical achievements she could only admire from a distance. Every Christmas, she mailed gifts to the Cactus Drive house, hoping that some small token of her love might reach the boy she considered more son than nephew. The last time she'd spoken to Mason directly was at a grocery store in 2003, a chance encounter in the frozen foods aisle. He'd been 15 then, tall and thin, with eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. They'd talked for maybe 3 minutes before Robert appeared, his hand heavy on Mason's shoulder as he steered the boy away from Susan like she was radioactive. "I miss you," she'd whispered as they walked past. Mason had looked back once, and in that glance, Susan saw everything: the longing, the fear, the desperate wish for rescue that he couldn't voice. August 17th, 2004. Mason had circled the date on his calendar for weeks. His 18th birthday was still 2 years away, but the Juilliard letter had specified that exceptional students could begin their studies early with parental consent, or by demonstrating independent living capability. Mrs. Rodriguez had explained the legal pathways. At 16, if he could prove abuse or neglect, he could petition for emancipation. All he needed was evidence. For months, Mason had been secretly recording his father's rages on an old cassette player hidden beneath his bed. The threats, the screaming matches that followed any mention of college or independence. He'd photographed bruises with a disposable camera, keeping the negatives in a shoebox alongside the Juilliard letter and $200 he'd saved from odd jobs around the neighborhood. The plan was simple. He would wait until Robert left for his evening shift at the office complex, then take the bus to the police station. He'd show them the evidence, file for emancipation, and be in New York by September. Mrs. Rodriguez had promised to help, had even offered to drive him to the station if needed. But Robert's paranoia had grown sharper in recent weeks. He'd been watching Mason with the intensity of a guard dog sensing an escape attempt. Conversations had become interrogations. Privacy had become non-existent. It was as if Robert could smell his son's plans for freedom. That Tuesday afternoon, as desert heat shimmered off the asphalt and the air conditioner wheezed against the Phoenix sun, Mason made his final preparations. Robert was due at work at 6 p.m. The evening bus to downtown Phoenix left at 6:15. Mason had memorized the schedule, practiced the route. He'd even written a letter explaining his decision, though he planned to be long gone before Robert found it. At 5:45 p.m., Mason heard his father's pickup truck rumble to life in the driveway. He waited until the engine sound faded, then moved quickly through the house, gathering his evidence, his money, his few precious possessions. The cassette tapes went into his backpack first, then the photographs, then the Juilliard letter that represented everything he'd ever wanted. He was reaching for the door handle when he heard the key turning in the lock. Robert stood in the doorway, his security guard uniform still crisp despite the heat, his expression unreadable. In his hand was a phone. Mason realized with horror that his father must have been listening to Mrs. Rodriguez's voicemails about the emancipation paperwork. "Going somewhere, son?" Robert's voice was calm, but Mason had learned to fear his father's calm more than his rage. The standoff lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, Mason saw his entire future collapse. Robert's eyes moved from the backpack to the letter clutched in Mason's trembling hand, and his face transformed into something Mason had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but a kind of cold, calculating fury that made his blood freeze. "Juilliard," Robert said, reading the letterhead. His voice was almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "My son, the musical genius, thought he could sneak away without telling his old man." Mason backed toward the living room, but there was nowhere to run in the small ranch house. Robert followed, still holding the phone, still speaking in that terrifying, reasonable tone. "You know what your mother tried to do, don't you, Mason? She tried to take you away from me. Said I was controlling. Said I was dangerous. Look how that turned out for her." The words hit Mason like physical blows. His mother's death had been an accident. Everyone said so. The police report confirmed it. But the way Robert spoke, the satisfaction in his voice, made Mason's stomach turn. "I won't let you make the same mistake she did," Robert continued. "You think the world out there cares about you? You think those people at that fancy school give a damn about some kid from Phoenix? I'm all you have, son. I'm all you've ever had." Mason tried to speak, to explain about the scholarship, about his dreams, but the words wouldn't come. 20 years later, he would remember this moment as the last time he tried to argue, the last time he believed there might be reasoning with his father. Robert moved closer, and Mason could smell the familiar mixture of aftershave and security guard polyester, could see the genuine panic behind his father's controlled exterior. This wasn't just about control. It was about a man who literally could not survive losing the only thing that gave his life meaning. "You're not going anywhere," Robert said, and suddenly his hands were on Mason's shoulders, steering him down the hallway toward the back of the house. "Ever." The guest room at the end of the hall had been used for storage since Mason's mother died, but as Robert pushed him inside, Mason realized that wasn't true anymore. The windows had been boarded up from the inside, painted over to look normal from the outside. The door had been fitted with a heavy deadbolt that could only be opened from the hallway. This wasn't storage. This was a cell, prepared and waiting. Within hours, Robert Parker had transformed from a controlling father into a grieving victim. He called the Phoenix Police Department at 11:47 p.m. on August 17th, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish as he reported his teenage son missing. He was upset about something, Robert told Officer Maria Santos, who responded to the call. "We had words about his grades, nothing serious. But you know how teenagers are. When I got home from work, he was gone. Just gone." Robert had prepared for this conversation for weeks. He showed Officer Santos Mason's room, pointing out the missing clothes, the empty dresser drawers, the absence of his son's most prized possessions. What he didn't mention was that everything missing was now locked in the storage room with Mason, part of the elaborate fiction that the boy had run away. "Has he ever done this before?" Santos asked, taking notes in her official pad. "No, but his aunt has been filling his head with ideas," Robert replied, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "She thinks I'm too strict with him. She's been encouraging him to rebel, telling him he should go to New York for some music school nonsense. I wouldn't be surprised if she's helping him hide." The seed was planted expertly. Susan Martinez, the troublemaking aunt with a history of interference. Mason Parker, the rebellious teenager with unrealistic dreams. A family dispute that had escalated into a runaway situation. It was a story that happened hundreds of times a year in Phoenix, and Officer Santos had no reason to doubt it. Within the guest room, Mason could hear his father's performance through the thin walls. The manufactured sobs, the carefully crafted concern, the way Robert painted him as an ungrateful child who had abandoned his devoted father. For the first time since his imprisonment began, Mason felt something worse than fear. He felt invisible. By morning, Robert was playing the role to perfection. He called Desert Valley High School to report Mason's absence, his voice hoarse with what the secretary assumed was exhaustion from searching all night. He contacted Mrs. Rodriguez to ask if she'd heard from his son, managing to sound both worried and accusatory, the perfect balance of a father who suspected his son's teacher of enabling bad decisions. "If you hear from Mason, please call me immediately," he told her. "He's confused right now, but he needs to come home where it's safe." Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to call, but something in Robert's tone bothered her. She'd worked with families in crisis for 15 years, and this didn't feel right. The Mason she knew wasn't impulsive or reckless. He was thoughtful, careful, someone who planned every move. Running away without telling her, especially when they'd been working together on his emancipation case, seemed completely out of character. Susan Martinez learned about her nephew's disappearance from a neighbor who'd seen the news report. "Missing Phoenix teen last seen Tuesday evening." The headline made her stomach drop, but it was the accompanying photo that destroyed her world. Mason, at 15, smiling at a school concert, looking exactly like her sister Claire at that age. She called the police immediately, demanding to speak to the officer handling the case. Officer Santos was polite but firm. The family had already been contacted, and Robert Parker was cooperating fully with the investigation. As for Susan's concerns about her brother-in-law, they'd been noted, but weren't considered relevant to the search. "Mr. Parker mentioned you might call," Santos said, her tone suggesting this conversation was expected. "He said you and Mason had a complicated relationship, that you'd been encouraging him to rebel against his father's authority." The way Santos spoke, it was clear Robert had gotten to her first, had shaped the narrative in his favor. Susan realized with growing horror that she wasn't being seen as a concerned aunt. She was being seen as a potential accomplice. "You don't understand," Susan said, her voice rising. "Robert is controlling, obsessive. He's isolated Mason since Claire died. This isn't normal teenage rebellion. Something's wrong." But her protests sounded exactly like what a guilty accomplice would say, and Santos had heard it all before. Bitter custody disputes, family members who couldn't accept a parent's authority, teenagers caught between competing adult loyalties. The Phoenix PD saw dozens of cases like this every month. Susan hung up the phone, feeling more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. If the police wouldn't listen, who would? She thought about hiring a private investigator, but on her salary as a middle school art teacher, that was impossible. She considered reaching out to local news stations, but what would she tell them? That her nephew was missing, and she suspected his father, despite having no evidence beyond a sister's intuition. For the first week, she drove through Phoenix neighborhoods every evening after work, searching parks and bus stations, and anywhere a scared teenager might hide. She posted flyers with Mason's picture, offering a reward she couldn't afford to pay. She called every shelter, every youth organization, every place that might take in a runaway kid. Nobody had seen him. Nobody had heard from him. It was as if Mason Parker had simply vanished from the face of the earth. By the end of August, the official search had quietly wound down. Officer Santos filed her final report, concluding that Mason Parker was likely a voluntary runaway who would return home when he was ready. The case remained open, but it was no longer active. Another statistic in a system overwhelmed by missing teenagers. But Susan never stopped looking. She couldn't. 20 years, 7,300 days of a life stolen, of dreams deferred, of a young man aging in a room that became both his universe and his grave. Mason's world had shrunk to 12 feet by 10 feet. The guest room that became his prison was furnished with the basics: a twin bed, a small dresser, a chair. Robert had installed a mini refrigerator and a hot plate, had run a water line to a small sink in the corner. There was a bucket for waste, emptied daily during Robert's controlled visits. It was efficient, clinical, and absolutely inhumane. For the first year, Mason had fought. He'd screamed until his voice gave out, had thrown himself against the reinforced door until his shoulders were raw and bloody. He'd tried to dig through the drywall with his fingernails, had attempted to tunnel under the foundation like some desperate prisoner of war. But the room had been prepared too well. The walls were reinforced with metal plating, the floor was concrete, and the single window had been not just boarded, but bricked over from the outside. By year 2, the fight had turned to pleading. Mason would beg during Robert's daily visits, would promise anything: obedience, gratitude, a complete abandonment of his musical dreams, if his father would just let him out. Robert would listen with what seemed like genuine sympathy, would even cry sometimes, but he never wavered. "I wish I could, son," he would say, "but you've proven I can't trust you. This is the only way to keep you safe, keep us together. Someday, you'll understand." Outside the room, Robert Parker had transformed into Phoenix's most dedicated single father. He kept Mason's school locker as a shrine, paying the fees each year to maintain it exactly as his son had left it. He attended every school board meeting, advocating for better programs to help runaway children. He volunteered with local search and rescue organizations, his face a familiar sight on missing persons posters and community bulletin boards. His co-workers at the security company saw a man destroyed by loss, but determined to help others avoid his tragedy. His neighbors saw a devoted father who never gave up hope, who still set 2 plates at dinner every night, just in case his boy came home. Local news stations interviewed him on the anniversaries of Mason's disappearance, and Robert's performance was always flawless. The right amount of grief, the perfect balance of hope and heartbreak. Inside the house, the real Robert was something else entirely. He had become Mason's entire world. Jailer, caretaker, and God all rolled into one. He controlled every aspect of his son's existence, from the books Mason was allowed to read to the temperature of the room. He brought meals 3 times a day, always staying to watch Mason eat, monitoring his weight and health with the obsessive attention of a scientist studying his subject. Mason's hair grew long and unkempt. His body, once lean and strong from youth, became soft and pale from lack of sunlight and exercise. His hands, which had once created beautiful music, grew soft and weak from disuse. But his mind remained sharp, preserved by sheer force of will and the desperate hope that someday, somehow, someone would find him. 2 decades of searching had turned Susan Martinez into someone she barely recognized. The young, hopeful art teacher had been replaced by a woman consumed with finding answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. Her apartment walls were covered with missing persons, flyers, timeline charts, and photographs of Mason at every age she could remember. She'd become her own private investigation unit, spending every spare dollar and every free moment on a case the world had forgotten. She'd hired 3 different private investigators over the years, each one taking her money and producing the same result. Nothing. Mason Parker had vanished completely, leaving no digital footprint, no paper trail, no witnesses to his whereabouts. The investigators always came to the same conclusion Susan refused to accept. Mason was either dead or living off the grid somewhere, possibly with help from people who didn't want him found. But Susan had something the investigators lacked: intimate knowledge of Robert Parker's true nature. She'd watched him isolate her sister, had seen the way he monitored Claire's every movement, had witnessed his ability to play the concerned husband while systematically destroying his wife's independence. If Robert could control a grown woman so completely, What could he do to a frightened 16-year-old? Every few months, Susan would drive past the house on Cactus Drive, parking across the street to watch for any sign of her nephew. The house looked exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. Same beige paint, same neat landscaping, same drawn curtains that never seemed to open. Robert still lived there alone, still maintained his routine of work and volunteering, and playing the grieving father for anyone who would listen. But Susan wasn't the only person watching the Parker house. Dorothy Chen had moved into the neighborhood in 2010, buying the small ranch house directly across the street. At 67, she was retired from her job as a Phoenix Public Library supervisor, and she had the kind of observational skills that came from decades of managing people and noticing details others missed. Dorothy had always been curious about her quiet neighbor. Robert Parker seemed nice enough. He kept his yard tidy, waved when she collected her mail, never caused any trouble. But there was something about the house that bothered her, some quality she couldn't quite name. It was too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. Over the years, Dorothy had noticed patterns in Robert's behavior that struck her as odd. He never had visitors, never left his curtains open, never seemed to go anywhere except work and the grocery store. His daily routine was precisely timed, leaving for work at 5:30 p.m., returning at 6:30 a.m., grocery shopping every Saturday at exactly 2 p.m. It was the kind of rigid schedule that suggested someone organizing their life around something hidden. Most strange of all were the sounds Dorothy sometimes heard late at night when the desert air was still and quiet. Not loud sounds. If they had been loud, she would have called the police years ago. But soft sounds, rhythmic sounds, like someone moving around in a space where they were trying not to be heard. When she'd mentioned it to Robert during one of their brief conversations, he'd explained it away easily. "Old house settling," he'd said with a sad smile. "Sometimes I swear I can hear Mason moving around up there, playing piano. Grief plays tricks on you, Mrs. Chen." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and Dorothy had accepted it. But the sounds continued, year after year, always at the same times, always with the same careful rhythm. March 15th, 2024, 20 years to the day after Mason Parker's high school graduation should have been, Susan Martinez was parked across from the Cactus Drive house, doing what she'd done hundreds of times before, watching, waiting, hoping for any sign that might lead her to her nephew. It was Dorothy Chen who changed everything. The elderly neighbor had been working in her garden when she noticed Susan's car, the same gray Honda Civic that appeared every few months for these vigils. But this time, instead of staying inside and pretending not to notice, Dorothy approached the car. "You're Mason's aunt," Dorothy said through the rolled-down window. It wasn't a question. Susan's heart stopped. After 20 years of being dismissed, ignored, and patronized by police officers and investigators and well-meaning friends, here was someone who knew who she was, who connected her to Mason without explanation. "You knew him?" Susan asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Dorothy said, settling her arthritic hands on the car door. "But I know something's not right in that house. I've lived across the street for 14 years, and I've been hearing things. Sounds that don't match Robert's story about living alone." The two women talked for nearly an hour, Dorothy sharing observations she'd been storing for years, without understanding their significance. The precise timing of Robert's schedule, the way he carried groceries into the house, always more food than one person could eat, always including items that seemed inconsistent with his solitary lifestyle. The sounds at night, regular as clockwork, coming from the back of the house where Robert claimed to keep storage. "I've been thinking about calling the police for months," Dorothy admitted. "But what would I tell them? That my neighbor buys too much food and has noisy plumbing. They'd think I was a crazy old lady." But Susan understood what Dorothy was describing, because she'd been searching for exactly these kinds of details for 20 years. The excessive groceries, the rigid schedule, the sounds from a supposedly empty house. They painted a picture that made her blood run cold. That afternoon, Susan called the Phoenix Police Department and demanded to speak to someone about Mason Parker's case. The desk sergeant tried to brush her off. 20-year-old missing person cases weren't exactly priority, but Susan's desperation finally broke through. Detective James Rodriguez, no relation to Mason's former teacher, agreed to meet with Susan and Dorothy the following day. Rodriguez was young, maybe 30, with the kind of fresh energy that hadn't yet been worn down by bureaucracy and impossible caseloads. More importantly, he listened. "Let me understand this," Rodriguez said, taking notes as Dorothy described her observations. "You're telling me that Robert Parker, who claims to live alone in a house where his son went missing 20 years ago, maintains a schedule rigid enough that you can set your watch by it, buys enough food for multiple people, and there are regular sounds coming from parts of the house that should be empty?" When Dorothy nodded, Rodriguez looked at Susan. "And you believe your nephew is being held in that house against his will?" "I know it sounds impossible," Susan said, "but Robert is capable of anything. He controlled my sister completely before she died. He's obsessed with keeping people close to him, no matter what it takes." Rodriguez studied the case file, 20 years of reports and dead ends and false hopes. But sometimes fresh eyes see what experienced ones miss, and Rodriguez saw something his predecessors had overlooked. Robert Parker had never actually been inside the house during any of the police visits. Every interview had been conducted on the front porch or at the police station. Every search had been limited to Mason's bedroom and common areas. Nobody had ever examined the entire house. March 18, 2024. 6:15 a.m. Detective Rodriguez knocked on the door of 247 Cactus Drive with a search warrant in his hand, and backup officers positioned around the house. Robert Parker answered the door in his bathrobe, his face showing exactly the right amount of confusion and concern for an innocent man being awakened by police. "Detective Rodriguez, Phoenix PD. We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with the disappearance of Mason Parker." Robert's performance was flawless. He stepped aside immediately, hands raised in a gesture of cooperation, his voice carrying just the right note of hurt bewilderment. "Of course, Detective. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to take this seriously. Please, search anywhere you want. I just want my son found." The officers moved through the house systematically. Living room, kitchen, bedrooms, closets. Everything appeared normal, lived in, but tidy. Exactly what you'd expect from a single man who'd been maintaining his home alone for 2 decades. Rodriguez was beginning to think they were chasing shadows when Officer Martinez called from the hallway. "Detective, you need to see this." The guest room at the end of the hall looked like storage space. Boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture covered with sheets. But Martinez had noticed something the other officers had missed. The door was too heavy for a simple bedroom door, and the frame showed scratches around what looked like a recently installed deadbolt. "Mr. Parker," Rodriguez called, "what's behind these boxes?" Robert's composure cracked for just a second, a flicker of panic that Rodriguez had been trained to spot. "Storage, Detective. Just old furniture and Christmas decorations. We haven't used that room for anything else since." He let his voice trail off, playing the grieving father card one more time. But Rodriguez was already moving boxes, and what he found behind them made his heart stop. The wall wasn't a wall, it was a false front, painted and textured to look like part of the room, but actually concealing a door. A door with a heavy deadbolt that could only be operated from the hallway side. "Jesus Christ," Officer Martinez whispered as Rodriguez turned the bolt. The smell hit them first, not decay or death, but the stale air of a space that had been sealed for too long. Human waste and unwashed bodies, and the particular odor of despair made tangible. Then Rodriguez pushed the door open, and they saw him. Mason Parker sat on a narrow bed, blinking in the sudden light like a cave creature seeing sun for the first time in decades. At 36, he looked far older, his hair long and gray, his skin pale as paper, his body thin from years of limited exercise and controlled nutrition. But his eyes were unmistakably alive, intelligent, aware. He looked at the officers with an expression Rodriguez would never forget. Not surprise, not relief, but a kind of careful hope that had been practiced and disappointed too many times to fully trust. "Are you real?" Mason asked, his voice rusty from disuse. Behind them, Robert Parker was screaming. Not denials or explanations, but rage at being discovered, fury at losing control of his perfect system. Two officers wrestled him to the ground as he fought like a man defending his most precious possession. "He's mine!" Robert shouted as they cuffed him. "He belongs to me. I saved him from that world. I kept him safe." The reunion between Mason and Susan took place in the sterile environment of Phoenix General Hospital, where Mason was undergoing medical evaluation after 20 years of imprisonment. When Susan walked into his room, she saw her nephew for the first time since that chance encounter in the grocery store. But this wasn't the 15-year-old boy she remembered. This was a man in his 30s, aged by trauma and isolation, his hands soft and pale from decades without piano practice. "Aunt Susan," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "You never stopped looking." It wasn't a question. During his captivity, Robert had told Mason about Susan's searches, using them as psychological torture, proof that the outside world would never find him, that even the people who loved him most would eventually give up. But Robert had been wrong. Susan's love had been the constant thread connecting Mason to the world he'd lost, and now it was the lifeline pulling him back. The medical evaluation revealed the full extent of Robert's crime. Mason was severely malnourished, his bones weakened by lack of sunlight and proper nutrition. His muscles had atrophied from years of confinement in a small space. Psychologically, he showed signs of severe trauma, but remarkably, his mind remained sharp, preserved by sheer force of will and the musical compositions he'd created in his head during the endless years. "I never stopped composing," he told Susan during one of their first conversations. "In my mind, I wrote symphonies, hundreds of them. I had to keep creating, or I would have died in that room." The trial of Robert Parker became a media sensation, the kind of case that captures public attention because it touches on every parent's worst fear and every family's darkest possibilities. Robert's defense attorney tried to paint him as a man driven insane by grief, a father who'd convinced himself that keeping his son imprisoned was the only way to protect him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The premeditated nature of the room's construction, the elaborate lies maintained for 20 years, the systematic psychological abuse Mason had endured. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse, maintaining to the end that he'd done what was necessary to protect his son from a dangerous world. Even faced with the destruction he'd caused, he couldn't see Mason as anything other than his possession. Mason's reintegration into the world was slow and painful. Simple things that most people took for granted, choosing what to eat, deciding when to sleep, walking outside without permission, were overwhelming challenges. But with Susan's support and intensive therapy, he began to rebuild a life that had been stolen from him. The most remarkable part of his recovery involved music. Mason's fingers, though weakened by years of disuse, remembered their training. Within months of his rescue, he was playing piano again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The compositions he'd created in his mind during captivity began to pour out onto paper, a 20-year symphony of survival and hope. Today, Mason Parker is 40 years old. He lives in a small apartment in Tempe, close enough to Susan that they can see each other regularly, but far enough from Cactus Drive that the memories don't overwhelm him. He teaches piano to children at a local music school, finding peace in helping others discover the same joy that sustained him through his darkest years. His students don't know his story. To them, he's just Mr. Parker, the quiet teacher with gentle hands and infinite patience. The house on Cactus Drive sits empty now, a monument to the horror that unfolded within its walls. Dorothy Chen still lives across the street, still watches, though now she watches for different reasons, making sure the memories of what happened there are never forgotten. Susan Martinez kept every missing person flyer, every police report, every dead-end lead from 20 years of searching. They fill 3 boxes in her closet now, a paper trail of love that refused to give up. Sometimes she looks through them and marvels at the power of persistence, at what one person's refusal to accept defeat can accomplish. Love doesn't give up, she tells people who ask how she never stopped believing. Real love never stops searching. Mason's story is a reminder that the most horrific crimes often happen behind closed doors, in places where no one thinks to look. It's a testament to the power of one person's refusal to accept easy answers, and the difference that persistence can make when everyone else has given up hope. Most importantly, it's proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can survive. Mason Parker lost 20 years of his life, but he never lost himself. In a room designed to break him, he composed symphonies. In isolation meant to destroy him, he held on to hope. And when rescue finally came, he was ready to live again. The music never stopped, it just waited.